These scenes of the sugar beet industry are part of our agricultural heritage here in the Yellowstone Valley. Hi, I'm Taylor Brown. Sugar beets are one of our most important crops, and the sophisticated equipment it takes to run that industry is a familiar sight today, even to city dwellers. But it wasn't always that way. 3/4 of a century ago, sugar beets were harvested with a lot of muscle power. We've been fortunate to acquire some rare film from the 1920s that'll help us see how sugar beets used to be harvested. William Brenner from Park City had this to say in 1924.
There are many things important to producing a bountiful beet harvest: manuring, good seed bed, skilled hand labor, good cultivation, and irrigation. A timely rain or the absence of adverse conditions also means a lot to beets.
In 1924, sugar beet farming in Yellowstone County made national news when the Fox Movietone News Company shot a 10-minute news release from the Grimrock Ranch at Custer, east of Billings. By the 1920s, local irrigation ditches and federally sponsored irrigation projects had diverted waters from the Yellowstone River and its tributaries, creating rich farmlands that grew not only sugar beets, but grains, hay crops, beans, and corn. The sugar beet, a large underground tuber, was harvested to produce refined white sugar. The beet byproducts and pulp were used for sheep and cattle feed. The establishment of the sugar beet industry in the Yellowstone River Valley of eastern Montana at the beginning of the 20th century rejuvenated the economies of several towns along the Yellowstone River. The locally organized Billings Sugar Company constructed a $1 million beet sugar company in 1906. In 1918, the Great Western Sugar Company bought the sugar beet factory and continued to promote the growing of sugar beets. Billings was proclaimed as the Sugar City, and the Yellowstone Valley entered a new era of prosperity.
This is my 24th beet crop. The big thing about growing a crop of sugar beets, it seems to me, is to get a stand. The short growing season requires a proper seed bed, early thinning, and good irrigation.
The back-breaking work of sugar beet farming was done with hand labor, with the help of some horsepower. The sugar beet fields required a large labor force, which brought about the immigration of German Russians, Japanese, and Europeans. By 1924, Mexicans would make up the majority of the seasonal workforce. The beet seeds were planted in April. By late June, the green leafy plants were thinned out so that each beet plant could receive the greatest amount of sunshine. Summer hailstorms could damage the canopy or leaf of the sugar beets. Although the foliage would grow back, the sugar content of the beets themselves would decrease. In early October, the harvest began. The beets were lifted out or pulled one row at a time. Placed in piles, the beets had to be free of dirt before being sent to the factory for processing. Field laborers would top the beets or cut off the green leaves. Using a large blade tipped with a 2-inch hook, they hooked the beet and lifted it. Then, holding the beet in one hand, they'd quickly chop off the leaves. The sharp blade could easily gash the leg of the worker using it. Dora Cantu, a Mexican migrant worker, recalls her work in the beet fields as a young girl.
We would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. We would work until an hour before being picked up. We would be out until 6 or 7. We would go to school, come home, and then work again until sundown.
The beets, each weighing up to 5 pounds, were shoveled onto large horse-drawn wagons that could carry up to 4 tons. The wagons and horse teams hauled the beets to be weighed at receiving stations located along the railroad tracks. When the wagon reached the top of the dump ramp, the sideboard was dropped. The beet foreman took a tare sample to determine a percentage of dirt weight on the farmer's beets. The sugar factory deducted from the farmer's tonnage and profits based on the tare sample. The driver returned to the scales, where the emptied beet wagon was weighed again. In areas with high-density beet acreage, the receiving stations were spaced every 3 to 5 miles along the railroad tracks. The beets were loaded on the cars and transported to the Billings Sugar Factory for final processing. Sugar beets were received from as far away as Sydney and Fairview in the lower Yellowstone Valley. At the factory, the beet transport train backed in to unload the sugar beets. Factory workers unloaded the beets with a beet fork, a tool that has round knobs at the end of each tine to avoid spiking the beets. Inside the factory, the beets were cleaned again and thinly sliced. The sliced beets were then processed and refined into white granulated sugar. The campaign or production stage of processing sugar beets would run into the new year. A full-page advertisement in the Billings Gazette on December 14, 1924, announced that the Billings plant of Great Western Sugar Company established a world's record in the production of beet sugar. Changes in the sugar beet industry were imminent soon after 1924, but perhaps the greatest change came in the 1930s and 40s when trucks and tractors started to replace the need for so much horsepower and intensive hand labor. But perhaps now, when we see these tractors, huge trucks loaded with sugar beets, and the complex machinery, we'll now have a better understanding of another part of our heritage here in the valley of the Yellowstone River.